The wind cut like glass through the bones of the trading post, lifting dust in lazy spirals and pressing against the warped wooden siding as if trying to push it down for good. Lenora Kane stood beneath the shallow overhang, her boots crusted in prairie mud, her breath a trembling mist in the cold dusk air. The baby in her arms wailed with the hollow cry of a child too hungry for sound, too tired for protest. Her left wrist throbbed beneath the dirty scarf wrapped tightly around it. Twisted hours ago when she'd fallen from the wagon trying to hold on to her things her kin didn't bother to help gather. They'd left her there, said the man her husband once trusted would take her in. Said they couldn't afford another mouth, not even the baby's. The trading post barely acknowledged her. Its windows were rimed with age, and inside, a kerosene lamp threw out flickering shadows against cracked walls. The shopkeeper had glanced up when she stepped in, her baby shrieking with hunger, then turned back to his ledger like she were just another gust of dust. "No handouts here, miss," he grunted. "You've got coin, or you've got nothin'." She had neither. It's just a buttonless coat, a shawl with more holes than wool, and the memory of her husband's words. Elias Mercer. If trouble comes, look for Elias Mercer. But she didn't even know what he looked like. Only that he once rode with her husband during the border war and that he'd saved lives. The baby whimpered in her arms. Face flushed from windburn, his lips searching for warmth she could no longer give. Lenora backed out of the store into the settling dusk. She leaned her shoulder against the post, her breath shallow, trying not to cry. The townsfolk walked by with their heads down, boots tapping, would like they were walking over a grave. Then she herded hooves, slow, deliberate. A single rider coming in off the road from the west. He rode a black horse, tall and lean like him. Dust clung to the hem of his coat, and frost melted slowly along the edge of his wide-brimmed hat. His face was unreadable, like canyon stone. No greeting, no ask. Just a quiet stillness that made the air seem to pause. He dismounted in one motion, boots hitting the dirt with a quiet thud. He looked at her first, not the baby, not the shopkeeper watching from behind the window butter. He said nothing, only stepped closer and gave a small nod toward the trading post's side door, where a stovepipe curled smoke faintly into the air. She didn't move. He didn't pressure. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flask. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands, raised it, then stopped. Her eyes met his again. "Are you Mercer?" she asked, voice barely more than wind. He didn't answer, just gave the faintest nod, like the question wasn't one that needed words. The drink burned going down, but it lit something inside her. Just enough warmth to keep from falling to her knees. He turned then, walking toward the back of the post, where a small fire glowed behind a heavy wooden door. Before stepping through, he paused, not looking back, and waited. Lenora looked, down at her baby, then at the door, then at the baby again. Pride curled in her like a wounded animal. She didn't want charity, but what did that matter now? She had a child. She had a wrist that would soon fail her entirely. And for the first time since the wagon left her behind, she wasn't invisible. She followed inside. The heat was gentle, not overbearing. The room was plain wooden chairs, a worn bearskin rug, a fire crackling in the hearth. A pot sat simmering. Nearby, coffee. The smell made her dizzy. Elias pulled a second chair near the fire and gestured toward it. Still, no words. Just the heavy, quiet kind of presence that said more than speech ever could. She sank into the chair, carefully unwrapped the baby, and laid him across her knees. The firelight played across his cheeks, softening the red marks from wind and cold. She looked at Elias, sitting across from her, eyes half-lidded, coat still on, hands resting palm down on his thighs. "Why?" she whispered. He didn't answer. But somehow, in that flickering room of smoke and silence, she felt it not pity, not obligation. Just the man who'd once stood where she stood now and hadn't forgotten. And though no one had spoken her name, no one had welcomed her, Lenora realized something rare had just happened. She had been seen. The first night passed in near silence, broken only by the baby's cries and the slow hiss of logs shifting in the hearth. Lenora hadn't slept, not fully. She sat curled on the edge of a makeshift cot near the fireplace, one eye always on the door, the other on Elias, who moved through his own house like a man avoiding ghosts. He hadn't asked her anything, not where she came from, not who the child's father was, not why her wrist was purple and twice its size, or why she flinched every time she moved it. When morning came, he lit the stove without a sound and poured hot water into a basin, laying out strips of clean cloth and something crushed in a wooden bowl, herbs, smelling of pine and vinegar. He knelt without a word. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, then nodded. The pain when he set the bone made her vision white out, and for a moment she thought she might scream. But she didn't. She bit the inside of her cheek and stared at the rafters, counting each groan of the old house until the worst passed. When it was done, Elias wrapped her wrist carefully and stepped away. No praise, no comment. Just the soft sound of him washing his hands in the basin and leaving the room. Over the next few days, the quiet stretched and settled like dust. The ranch house was sturdy but tired. There were things left behind, a thin shawl still hanging near the door, its fringe unraveling. A child's name scratched faintly into the doorframe near the kitchen, the wood worn smooth from years of glances. A second chair always pulled out, always empty. Lenora noticed everything. Elias rose early and spent most of his time outside, tending the stock, chopping wood, checking the fence lines. He always returned with a bit of snow on his coat, even though it hadn't yet begun to fall. The sky was warning them, though. Each cloud a shade darker, the light thin and brittle. She kept to the fire, feeding the baby, resting her wrist, watching the shadows in the corners of the room stretch as the day wore on. Sometimes she'd find herself staring at his hands, rough-worn, scarred, and wonder what they'd done in years past, what they had held, what they had lost. At night he made a simple supper. He always set 2 plates, hers and his, but never 3. That absence became a kind of presence. He would light a second lamp, always the one on the table by the far window. But just before sitting down to eat, he'd lean over and snuff it out again, as though remembering too late that no one needed it anymore. Lenora didn't ask, and he never offered. When he finally spoke to her, truly spoke, it was 3 nights in, while brushing down the horses in the barn. She had wandered outside, baby swaddled against her chest in a blanket made of old feed sacks, following. The sound of his boots on packed earth. "The Palomino bites," he said, without looking up. She stood just outside the stall, resting her weight against the frame. "I've handled worse," she replied, surprising herself. He glanced at her then, just for a second, and the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but something lived in it. After that, they began to trade sentences, slow and sparse, like a pair of old wolves learning not to bare teeth. He told her about horses, how to calm one in the wind, how not to approach from behind, how some couldn't be broken but made. Good friends anyway. She listened. Then one morning, while folding the baby's cloth, she said softly, "My husband was afraid of horses. Said they were too much like people. It's unpredictable when spooked." Elias didn't answer. Just leaned. In the doorway, with the brim of his hat low, and the light catching the lines in his face, the wind picked up that night. It howled through the gaps in the shutters like a wounded thing. Lenora wrapped herself and the baby tighter and sat near the fire again. Watching the sparks lift into the chimney and disappear, there was grief. Here, in the walls. In the way Elias moved around the house. But it wasn't bitter, just heavy, settled, like earth after a burial. She understood that kind of silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was full of names that would never be said again. The snow came fast, without much warning, as if the prairie sky had simply decided to close itself off from the world. By midday, the wind howled down from the north and swallowed everything in white. The light outside the windows turned to a dull, pewter gray, and by late afternoon, it was nearly impossible to see past the porch rail. Elias had seen it coming. He moved quicker than usual, checking the animals, the chimneys, the windows. Just as he stepped back inside to grab a lantern, the sound hit a groan, then a loud, splintering crack. The barn roof, he muttered. He didn't have time to explain. He grabbed his coat, tossed one toward Lenora, and motioned toward. "The back door, I can't lift anything," she said, holding up her bound wrist. "Need your other hand?" He answered. She didn't hesitate. The wind nearly knocked her sideways as they pushed out toward the barn. Ice slid down from the eaves, catching in her hair and soaking through the shawl she'd wrapped tight. Inside, part of the roof had buckled, snow piling through a jagged hole, burying sacks of oats and half the tool bench. Elias didn't curse, didn't flinch. He simply started pulling things free, his breath steaming in the air. She followed, one-handed and slow, dragging a crate across the frozen ground. They worked without words, side by side in the half-light, boots crunching over broken shingles and splintered rafters. By the time they'd cleared what they could and secured the doors, night had fallen. The house was warmer than she remembered, but the baby wasn't. He'd been crying when they left. But now his cries were hoarse and broken, his cheeks flushed, his skin hot to the touch. Lenora cradled him with panic climbing into her throat. "He's burning up," she said, her voice rising. He was fine this morning," Elias didn't answer. He knelt beside her, placing a rough hand on the baby's brow. Then he stood and crossed the room, gathering towels, filling the kettle, corking a bottle of old whiskey from the cupboard, rubbed this into his chest and feet. "Boil water, keep steam in the room." Lenora obeyed, trembling. The smell of the whiskey was sharp, clinging to her hands, her sleeves, the baby's blanket. She rocked him gently, whispering the same lullaby she'd heard her mother sing when she was small. Though she couldn't remember the words, only the hum, Elias worked beside her, building the fire higher, hanging wet towels on chairs too. Trapped the steam, the kettle hissed. The baby shivered, whimpered, then quieted, too tired to fight. It wasn't until hours later, long after the cries had faded and the fire burned low, that Lenora let herself breathe. She sat with her back against the stone hearth, the baby limp and asleep against her shoulder. Elias was a few feet away, seated on a wooden stool, elbows on his knees. Watching the coals settle, she turned her head slightly toward him. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't nod, didn't shrug, just stared ahead for a long while. "Wife's name was Cora," he said finally. "She died giving birth, took the child with her." The room fell still again. Even the wind outside quieted. "That was 8 winters ago," he said. Lenora didn't speak. Weight of what he'd said hovered between them like the smoke still curling up the chimney. "I built this place for them," he added. "Never got to finish the second room." His voice wasn't rough now, just tired, like a river that had worn down every rock it ever touched. "I thought I hated the sound of crying after that," he said. "Turns out I just missed hearing it for the right reasons." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the stoic man who'd wordlessly helped her off the road or tended her wrists with practiced hands. A man who carried silence the way others carried grief, heavy, always, and close to the heart. They didn't say anything more that night. The fire dimmed. The storm beat against the walls like it wanted in. But inside, there was warmth. Just from the flames, but from the slow, painful closeness of two people who had nothing left to lose. And perhaps for the first time, something to protect. Lenora held her baby closer and closed her eyes, and somewhere near the fire, Elias Mercer sat, still and quiet, thinking of the names he'd buried and the sound of one new life breathing softly through the storm. The storm passed in the night, but the world it left behind was silent and frozen. Snow lay heavy on the fences and rooftops. The land stretched wide and white, and the wind had stopped screaming, replaced by an eerie hush, as if everything was holding its breath. Inside the house, life took on a rhythm. Slow, careful. Lenora didn't ask permission. She just began folding the dry shirts Elias left near the hearth. They're sweeping ash from the stone floor, rinsing dishes with snow melted. Over the fire, her left wrist still ached. But she learned how to twist a kitchen knife or hold a brush with the strength of one hand and the stubbornness of two. Elias never commented. But he didn't stop her either. She fed the baby, tucked her into a cradle. Made from a padded apple crate Elias had once used for tools, and hung up her damp cloths near the stove each night. There was peace in the routine. Quiet, warm-breathed peace. Until Sheriff Talbot arrived. It was midday when he rode up. A broad man with a long coat the color of dry dirt and a badge that caught the sun. He didn't knock, just stepped off his horse and stood on the porch like he'd come for something he didn't quite believe was there. Elias opened the door with a stillness that only comes from a man who has buried too many things to be surprised anymore. Talbot looked past him, straight at Lenora, who stood by the table with her child pressed tight to her hip. "Didn't know you were talking in borders, Mercer?" Elias didn't blink. "Didn't know I had to ask." The sheriff tilted his head. "Folks in town. Our token. Some don't think it's right. A woman alone, living out here with a man who ain't her kin. With a baby, no less." The words hit her like a slap. She swallowed them down. Elias's jaw tensed. "Folks in town don't run my house." Talbot looked at her again. "Longer this time, ma'am. You got a name?" She straightened her back. "Lenora Kane." "No family?" She hesitated. "Not anymore." That was all she said, and it was enough. The sheriff nodded slowly, adjusted his gloves, and tipped his hat. "Well, let's hope the snow keeps folks too busy for tongues to wag much more." Then he left, the door closed. The silence that followed was worse than the one after the storm. That night, Lenora cleaned the kitchen more carefully than usual. The baby fussed less, as if even she could feel the weight in the air. When Elias sat near the fire, rifle across his lap, she paused in the doorway and watched him. He didn't hold the weapon like a threat. He wasn't polishing it or checking the chamber, just resting his hand on the stock. Running his thumb over something small carved into the wood. C.M. The letters were faint, but deep.
Oh.
They'd been pressed in with care. She didn't ask whose initials. She didn't need to. Later, when the house had gone dark, she found something. Tucked beneath the edge of the cradle blanket, a tiny lock of baby hair she had trimmed days ago, curled like a question mark. She sat on the bed, lit only by the dying fire, and wove it gently into her own braid. Not out of sentiment, but defiance. This was her daughter. This was her story. And it would not be twisted into someone else's shame. In that gesture, the rifle on the wall, the braid at her temple, they each made quiet declarations. He remembered who he had lost. She claimed what she still had. Outside, the cold crept in again, but the house stood firm. Warm with the breath of a child and the weight of two people who no longer bent their heads when the world whispered behind their backs. The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when Elias stepped out to the sound of sharp thuds near the shed. For a moment he thought it was the wind again, knocking loose shutters or a swinging pail. As he rounded the corner he saw her. Lenora stood in her worn shawl, sleeves rolled past her elbows, breath misting in the air. A rusted axe was planted in a chopping stump, and beside it a pile of crooked kindling, uneven, splintered, stubborn. She gripped a log with her left hand, the wrist still bound with layers of cloth, and swung again with her right. The axe slipped. The log barely split. Elias didn't speak. He just walked forward, slowly. She looked up, cheeks flushed not from cold, but shame. "I can do it." He didn't reach for the axe. He didn't tell her she couldn't. Instead, he stepped close, took her wrist gently in his weathered hand, and said, quiet as the morning frost, "You don't have to earn warmth." Her lips parted like she might argue, but the words never came. She let the axe fall, and for the first time, let him carry something she'd never offered anyone since her husband died. Her burden. Later that afternoon, they rode into town. The baby tucked close to Lenora's chest, her shawl drawn tight against the breeze. They needed flour, salt, and Elias wanted to check the post. The snow had thawed enough to make the roads muddy. and the trading post porch was half covered in slush and boot tracks inside. It was the usual mix of silence and murmured glances, the woman with the baby, the widower who didn't talk. Then, a voice cut through the air like cracked bone. "Well, if it ain't Lenora Lee, you still dragging that brat around?" Her chest stiffened. The man who stumbled forward smelled of whiskey and wood smoke. His beard was unkempt, his coat ripped at the hem. She recognized him, her cousin. The one who'd told her after the funeral that she'd wasted the cane. Name. That no man would take a widow with a mouth and a child too loud for its own good? "You don't get to touch her," she said, backing away as he reached toward the child. He laughed. Staggering, but the laughter stopped. Elias stepped between. Them quiet as falling snow. He didn't say a word. Just stood broad, still, steady, his hands relaxed. But ready. The cousin blinked, then faltered, the way cowards do when they realize they're not in charge anymore. "I was just saying hello," he muttered, turning away. Elias didn't move until the door shut behind him. They finished their errands in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because nothing needed saying. That night, the fire crackled low. The baby slept curled like a kitten beside Lenora, one small hand poking free of the blanket. She reached down, lifted it gently, and placed it in Elias's open palm where it rested against his knee. He looked at it, then at her. He didn't move. Her voice didn't rise. Her eyes didn't ask. But in that moment, between firelight and silence, something shifted. He didn't pull away. She didn't explain. It was not an invitation. It's not a confession. It was a truth made of gesture. She trusted him with the only part of herself that hadn't already been taken. The fire hissed. The shadows danced. And between them, something warm began to take root. Not passion, not yet, but something far rarer. A man who stood for her, and a woman who, for the first time in a long time, wasn't waiting to fall. The snow melted slow that year. It retreated like a secret, peeling back layer after layer of white until the earth beneath showed itself again, stubborn, scarred, and ready. The creek began to murmur once more. Birds returned with cautious songs. And in the fields behind the ranch house, the child took her first steps. Lenora watched her daughter wobble from the porch to the edge of the frost-touched grass. Arms out like wings, face lit with the kind of joy only the very young or the very brave know. Elias stood nearby, leaning on the fence, saying nothing, but the softness in his eyes betrayed him, inside the house. The cradle was still there, but the shawl was gone from the peg. It now lay folded in Elias's saddlebag. That morning, Lenora spoke without meeting his eyes. The thaws come, should be heading somewhere. Maybe Idaho, maybe nowhere. Elias finished, brushing the mare. Quiet, steady. "You're not a burden," he said. "I didn't say I was." He nodded once, then turned to the barn. When he came out again, the horse was saddled. 2 blankets. One child's satchel, tied behind the cantle. Her shawl folded with care. She frowned. "You saddling for me?" "No," he said. "For us." They rode together into town, not in silence, but in peace. It's a kind of peace you don't speak of for fear it'll vanish. The townsfolk looked, but the stares weren't quite the same. Anymore, maybe it was the child's laughter. Maybe it was the way Lenora sat tall in the saddle, brayed long and proud, the sun catching on her scarred wrist. Or maybe it was Elias beside her, quiet as always, but no longer alone. They stopped in front of the church, the same one that had locked its doors on her wedding day years ago, when she was too young and not pure enough. Now, its windows glowed with morning light, and the preacher stood on the steps, like he'd been waiting for someone he'd nearly forgotten. They dismounted. Elias held her shawl as she carried the baby in both arms, walking past the same faces that once looked through her. This time she didn't lower her eyes. Inside, the preacher opened the dusty family ledger. His voice trembled just slightly when he asked, "Do you wish to sign the book?" Elias looked to Lenora. He didn't smile. Didn't shift. "If she signed with me," the preacher nodded. "No ceremony. No flowers, just two names, written slowly on the same page. Outside, a breeze passed through the valley, shaking the last of the frost from the cottonwood branches. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called low and sweet. They left without fanfare. No handshakes, no speeches. Just the sound of hooves on thawed ground, and a future rising ahead of them like sun-warmed hills. No one clapped, no one cheered. But for the first time, the road behind them felt like something finished, and the one. Ahead, wide, wild, unpromised, felt like home, not because it had been given, but because they had made it.